was a wet, windy Sunday afternoon, and my husband and I were poking through the cupboards trying to decide what to have for lunch. And I pulled out this unopened jar of picante sauce that I'd forgotten we had. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with picante sauce, it's kind of like salsa. It's got a tomato base with onions and other good stuff, which usually includes either chili or jalapeno peppers. And I was excited about finding that jar, but my husband looked at it with horror and he asked me, did I really have enough courage to eat it? He is not a fan of spicy food. And I laughed because I was looking at the container of wasabi peas in the cupboard, and I reckoned that I was indeed courageous enough to try the picante sauce. But it all made me start thinking about what courage actually is. Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad Podcast. I'm your host, Trudy Rankin, and thank you so much for joining me today. Now, as I was saying earlier, this whole discussion around hot and spicy food and whether I was courageous enough to eat the picante sauce really did make me start to question what courage actually is. I had recently read this book, and it's by someone who is one of my husband's old work colleagues. Her name's Leonie Katakar, and she wrote about her experience of riding a bike through South America right down to the southernmost tip, right there to Tierra del Fuego. And her book is called When We Are Not Afraid. And reading that book reminded me that courage is often thought of as a brave act, kind of like rescuing someone who's in danger. Or it could be a moral act, like telling the truth when you know you'll be punished for it, or standing up to a bully when it's highly likely you're going to get punched on the nose or laughed at on social media. But I would also argue that courage can include pushing yourself well out of your comfort zone, like Leonie and her bike ride, so that you can develop new skills and reach a higher level of maturity and do things that you probably once thought were impossible. But that's actually a lot of definitions of courage. So what exactly is courage and how do we define it? Now, not that long ago, I was out walking and there was this young teenager riding his bike towards me down the path. And there's nothing really remarkable about that. I see people riding bikes there all the time. What was remarkable was that he was deliberately riding with no hands. Now, when I was a kid, we used to have a saying that went something like, "Look, Ma, no hands. Look, Ma, no teeth." So was this young lad being courageous? Was he being silly? Or was he just a kid enjoying the feeling of freedom that riding with no hands brings? And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I'm kind of interested in this. There's lots of different ways of looking at courage. And so I want to read you 3 quotes about courage that I found. And I found these particular quotes particularly inspiring. And I thought that they could be applied to any of us who are starting and growing small businesses or who are getting involved in a startup, maybe for the first time. And the first one I have is by Winston Churchill. And he said that success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And of course, for him, Winston Churchill was the prime minister, during World War II. He was prime minister of UK during World War II. And for him, courage is the same thing as commitment and continuing on no matter what happens. And that is actually really relevant to the life of an entrepreneur, whether you're a solopreneur, a micro business, or head of a massive startup. Keeping on is what gets us to success in the end. Now, my husband and I recently went camping at a place called Walhalla, or depending on how you choose to pronounce the word, Valhalla, which is what I would normally pronounce it at, but most people call it Walhalla. There was a lot of gold mining happening in this town in the late 1800s. And we went for a walk and we're looking at all the signs and things. And out of all of the stories we read about the place, there was one thing that leapt out at me. And here's the quote from the sign they put up about it. And it said, in 1864, the Squatters Junction Company was working a large claim, which went on to become the Long Tunnel Company 1865. The first 8 years of mining work resulted in the recovery of no gold, and the investors received no dividends. And that would be pretty painful. But the quote continued and it said, in the following 18 months, all previous expenditure was recovered And if you were one of the early investors, you would have received a massive 10,240% return on your investment. So talk about needing to be patient and resilient. 8 years is a very, very long time to find gold, but it was worth it in the end. Now, the second quote that I found was from Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was married to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She was the First Lady of the United States from 1933 to 1945, which included the time during World War II. And during World War II, everywhere in the world, but in the US as well, it was not an easy time for anyone. And for her, she felt that courage was all about feeling the fear and doing the hard thing anyway. And she said that you gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You are able to say to yourself, I lived through this horror. I can take the next thing that comes along. And I thought that was very, very wise, because for someone who's thinking about making the leap from being an employee to being their own boss, you're going to need courage, because it's scary leaving behind wages and a salary for the uncertainty of how much money you'll actually be able to bring in. But I have to say, based on my own experience, it is actually so worth doing. Just that sense of knowing that it was now all down to me, but that I didn't have to jump through a bazillion hoops anymore to get permission to do things was really, really, really amazing. And so I really resonated with the quote that Eleanor Roosevelt shared, feeling the fear. Courage is feeling the fear and doing the hard thing anyway. Now, the third quote I want to share with you is from Brené Brown. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of Brené Brown, she's a professor, a lecturer, an author. She's a podcast host. She's done a lot of things. And she's done a lot of research on shame, vulnerability, and leadership. And she did a TEDx talk that's well worth watching on vulnerability. And she says that vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. And so she's defining courage by what it is not. It is not weakness. And to her, by definition, courage is being vulnerable rather than hiding behind a false front. Now, we could talk about what vulnerability means for a long time, especially when it comes to sharing what things are really like for you as a human being and a business owner, whether that's in a social media post, a blog post, or an email out to your list. So now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about courage, I'd actually like you just to take some time to define what courage means to you, especially as someone who's building and growing a business or who wants to start their own business. I highly recommend that you take a couple of minutes or 5 and just mull over these questions that I'm going to share with you about courage. And I have to confess, I don't have the answers to these questions that I'm going to ask you, but I think the questions are worth thinking about. And the first question is what does being courageous mean to you? Has there been a time when you've shown that particular sort of courage? And have you ever seen someone else display that type of courage? The second question is, can you think of another example in today's world of entrepreneurs where someone has shown a different sort of courage? What did they do and why was that courageous? And the third question I have is there a difference between bravery and courage? Are they the same thing? Are they different? Are they synonyms? And the fourth question is, would you call it courage when we push ourselves outside of our comfort zones? The fifth question is there such a thing as false courage, where what looks like courage is actually naivety or ignorance? And my last question is, can you have courage without fear? And finally, I want to share one last quote with you. It's from Mahatma Gandhi, and to me, it embodies the intersection of courage and how the development of courageous habits is vital to building a successful business. And he said, your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. So the question that I had after reading that was, how can we develop habits that will make it much more likely we will be courageous when we need to be, when it comes to basically building a business, starting and building a business? So I started thinking about that, this whole question about how do you build habits. And it reminded me of a book that I've read recently and that I've also talked about already on the podcast. And it's by James Clear. It's his book, Atomic Habits: Tiny Changes, Remarkable Results, an Easy and Proven Way to Build Good Habits and Break Bad Ones. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this book, but he had some really, really useful and valuable things to say. Just going to very briefly share just a couple of the bits out of it and just recommend the book to you as one to read if you're thinking about building new habits, better habits, changing old habits, whatever. But his book defines a habit as a routine or practice performed regularly, an automatic response to a specific situation. So, for example, I'm working on developing the habit of writing to my email list more often with content that is engaging and helpful. And in his book, Atomic Habits, James Clear lays out 4 steps to creating a new positive habit. But before he even starts talking about what those steps are, he makes it very clear that if we want to successfully develop new habits, we need to think of ourselves as who we will be in the future with this new habit, rather than who we are right now. So for me, wanting to build a solid habit of writing high quality content more often, I need to think of myself as someone who enjoys the process of writing and likes helping people make that next little step towards successfully building their business. It's important to think of myself like that. Otherwise, the thought of having to write something on a very regular basis can be a little bit overwhelming. So his first step towards developing a positive habit is to make the cues that trigger the habit obvious. And he says that the process of behavior change always starts with awareness. So my goal is to send out 2 emails each week. One is a weekly digest that directs people back to listen to the new podcast episode that's come out. And the other is a short story that engages, plus an action to take that will be helpful for the person reading it. So I'm working to make it very easy to spot ideas in the wild. So I've started carrying a notebook with me so that when I spot an idea or I can see something happening around me that triggers an idea in my mind, that I can jot that idea down straight away. So if we kind of look back to what he was saying, he says, make the cues that trigger the habit obvious. For me, that's about listening more carefully to what's happening around me, observing more closely, and thinking about what I'm seeing could make a good story. And then his second step is make the act of creating the habit attractive. And he uses this formula: when situation X arises, I will perform response Y. And so for me, as soon as I can, after I've jotted down an idea, I will open up ActiveCampaign, which is the email service provider I use. I open up a draft email and I pop the story idea in, just using bullet points and thoughts, no proper sentences. It's really messy, but the goal is to have the story idea captured and written down in 5 minutes or less. Now, the attractive part of that is that when it comes time to actually writing the email, I'm not staring cross-eyed at a blank screen. So far, this is working really well for me. Now, step 3 is about making working on your new habit easy to do. It's all about the environment. And James Clear says that every habit is context dependent. So you need to design your environment for success. So for me, and this might not be what James Clear actually had in mind, but in order to create the right environment, I get out of the house, I get away from my computer, and I go to a cafe, usually for lunch. And as I do that, I invariably see or hear something along the way that triggers a thought that I can then turn into an idea for my story-based email, and sometimes for the email telling people about that week's podcast. And doing that, being in that environment that exposes me to other people and other things happening, just makes it so much easier to move on to step 4. And step 4 is, as James Clear says, to make the experience of working on your new habits satisfying, because he says what is immediately rewarded is repeated. And that's so true, because that's human nature. So he says you need to work with a grain of human nature, not against it. The best way to do this is to add a little bit of immediate pleasure to the habits that pay off in the long run, and a little bit of immediate pain to ones that don't. So basically, from my perspective, I think that instant gratification can be a really good thing when it comes to developing new habits. I like eating out. I like going out to cafes. I like getting out of the house, getting away from my home office. And maybe I'm paying my reward forwards, but it works for me. So I go eat out. I get ideas. I immediately write them down. And when I get home, I transfer them to a draft email. And then once I've refined the email and I've sent that email out, I get to go out again to find the next idea and the next meal out, which is kind of cool. So what's not to like about that? So there you have it. Being a business owner or starting your own business takes courage. It takes a lot of courage. And I love it that there are things that you can do to help build habits that make those daily acts of courage easier to do, to the point where you don't have to think about them. You just do them, just like with me writing my ideas down. And every time you do them, you're building something that's helpful, sustainable, and successful. So if you're someone who has been thinking about taking the leap and setting up your own business, but you're not sure where to start, we can help you here at Online Business Liftoff find an idea that's right for you, and then we can show you how to get that business started. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, go to onlinebusinessliftoff.com/coaching and community. And there's a little dash between the coaching and the community. Go there for more information and then join us in the Online Business Liftoff community, and we'll help you get your business going. So once again, that's onlinebusinessliftoff.com/coaching-and-community. And we'll see you next time.